So here we have the burst from Befaco. Now burst is an 8 HP burst generator. It has an onboard clock where we can tap tempo, which is also known as a ping input, which is a term that 4MS use as well. We can set this to loop, as you can see it is currently, or one shot. We can set the quantity, the amount of notes that will burst within a given space, and these multiply that ping, that clock. So we can have a ×1, a ×2, a ×3, a ×4. And because they're multiplications, when we're playing this against other sounds, we can make polyrhythmic patterns. A ×3 would be a triplet, ×5 would be a quintuplet, and so on. We can CV that quantity from 1 to 16 bursts, spaced within that given time frame, set by the tempo that it's running at. We've got a distribution control, which is a great unique control that will take us from evenly spreading however many bursts within a given space, say 5, they'll all be completely evenly spread. To the left, this will start slowly and speed up, like a bouncing ball style effect, and to the right, they will start fast and slow down. Almost how I guess you'd scrape a gyro if you were playing a gyro. And this is completely variable. The attenuator, the knob for quantity CV is an attenuator, as you can see by this little times icon. The CV input for distribution will add to the knob's position. We've got a tempo, division and multiplication. And again, the CV will add to the knob position, allowing us to modulate that. We've got a probability, which is great because we can have this cycling. And let's just speed it up a little bit. And if we change probability and watch the output, it's not always going to hit. And again, we can CV, which will add to that probability position. So this works when it's looping. It works when it's not. We get an end of cycle output. We get a tempo output, which will give us the tempo that we're running at, independent of any modulation. So that's great if we've tapped in a tempo, that's the master tempo for the whole setup, and we want to modulate burst and really play around but keep everything else steady so we can patch out and clock other things. You've got the trigger to make it happen, the manual button, ping again is the tempo input. Let's get into a range of patches to check out burst. So in this patch, we're going to use the burst as a percussion synthesis method, or part of percussion synthesis. Now, if I kill my other sounds, here's a clap sound, which is way louder than anything else because that's what we're using the burst for. Now, the burst output is coming into an envelope. So the envelope's been triggered by the output of the burst, these 3 bursts in quick succession. Now, if I change the envelope times, you can hear those bursts. Probabilities up full. This is completely unsynced, so I can use the tempo. Just to control the kind of spacing of these. Distribution can either make them start slow and kind of ramp up towards each other, which is like a bouncing ball effect, or start fast and then slow down. And we'll demonstrate distribution in a second. Quantity CV doesn't have anything in. Manual triggering. This can loop. Don't want it to loop in this instance. And these LEDs show us how many bursts we have. And notice they speed up from 1 to 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, and so on. And this is multiplying the tempo. I am actually triggering this in time, but I'm not pinging the tempo. So again, it's relative to the ping input and the timing divide and multiply. So we can create polyrhythms with this device by taking a steady clock and creating triplets for free. We could create twos or fours or quintuplets, septuplets, all these different multiplications that when played over other rhythms will create polyrhythm. Now I want 3 little hits. Here's a kick, just to show its placement within a beat. And let's just quickly demonstrate distribution. Here's going all the way left. You can hear it's slow to take up, like a bouncing ball effect. And it's completely variable, and we can CV it. In the middle, they're even. Starting faster and slowing down. Now doing that with 3. I'm quite happy with as a clap. Now I'm using it with noise and a VCA and the output triggering the envelope that's opening the VCA, because clap sounds tend to have multiple transients. So opening my envelope time a little bit, we get a good convincing electronic clap sound. Now the nice thing here is probability. If I take it to 0, the trigger will just pass a single hit through. You can hear that a bit clearer with a longer envelope time. Probability at half. We can see the output. It's not always firing. Now, let's take probability back up full. Shorten my envelope, and let's play around with a quantity CV. And we can see the CVs moving, but it's only playing the one when we actually fire and trigger it. Drop the probability. Open up my envelope time. With a nicely varying, tight little burst. That we're using for this clap. We get an end of cycle output, which is triggering this sound. Nice sort of wonky shuffle. If we had this locked in time and we were dividing and multiplying, the placement of this would be slightly different. Bit of reverb. And a little extra FM sound. And there's my little clap patch with the burst. So in this patch, we're using burst to trigger this sound. We are pinging it to tempo lock it and re-triggering it, but this is also looping. It would trigger regularly anyway for the trigger, or I can just leave it to loop. We have our tempo output, which works with the divide and multiply, but I'm not using that. The end of cycle, which we'll come to shortly. And I'm using this to actually just create multiplications of the clock, or the ping, this green cable. The green trace on data is what's clocking burst. The blue trace is its output. The kick drum just sets the tempo, as does a little clap. We've got some reverb and a little background sound just for some fun. Now playing around with quantity is going to give me different multiplications of this clock. Triplets. Now with 4, let's just check out that distribution again. We can hear it starts slow and ramps up. To being straight. To starting faster and slowing down. And let's try that with a higher number. We could divide and multiply the clock. But what's also great here is the probability. So this is being fired, we can tell it to loop as well. So even without triggering this, we can still use the probability that this rhythm will come out. That will work while triggering it too. So even just as a looping rhythm generator, we've got the probability, which we could CV, division and multiplication, the quantity amount. There's lots to go at. Now let's try modulating the CV, quantity. Probability back up full. And this would be good for trap-like hi-hats, those ratcheting rhythms you would find in a trap beat. This will work under probability as well. And that end of cycle output is changing depending on probability. When this is regular, we get a regular end of cycle. When it's not, we're getting gaps in the rhythm. And that would be great for triggering other sources, resetting sequences, triggering modulation or other sounds. So here's a melodic example of quite heavy modulation of the burst. I'm using a clock to clock the muck slicer and a division of that same clock to trigger the burst. And I've just inputted the ping from this same trigger and removed it. It will remember the tempo, which is great if you want to pull out that cable and use it for something else. So my pitch sequence is muck slicer. Video demo for muck slicer is linked in the description. That's controlling pitch. The output of the burst is triggering the gates in my sequence, which is why we're getting these little bursts of the melody. I've got a mixture of stepped and smooth modulation from LFOs and sample and hold into the quantity CV, the distribution to either make these slow and ramp up or fast and slow down, or just straight rhythms, straight multiplications. I'm modulating the divide and multiplication of the time, probabilities under modulation, and I'm taking the end of cycle output to trigger a bass drum to show how the end of cycle output changes depending on what the burst is doing. So burst is triggering the melody, end of cycle's triggering the kick, and let's just listen for a second before we move on. So for this patch, we're going to use an accent pattern to create little ratchets and bursts in my sequence. Now my sounds are a kick, just keeping time, the sequence that we're going to affect, and this is triggered by the output of the burst. At the minute, just playing one note once. We can up those bursts, but this is just one. You can't really have one burst, but one is just passing through this trigger and ping that I've already pinged it with. We could double, triple, and so on. There's this tiny noise in the background if you can hear it. Just because I like the kind of sidechain pumping in my headphones, but it's really quiet, so it might not come through. But here it is all together. So here's the ping, which came out of the ping because burst remembers the tempo, and into the trig. Here's the output of burst on the blue trace. And here's my accent pattern. A I've really attenuated that CV down, so when I plug this in, it's just going to move it to play 2 notes instead of 1. The more I open up this CV, when this yellow trace on data, the accent pattern is high, we're getting these bursts coming through. But I only want it to do 2 extra notes. If this is 16th notes, which is how I'm thinking of the tempo and the rhythm in the patch, I just want a burst of 32nd notes. So from fully attenuated to letting those bursts through. Now the pattern's a little bit busy, so I could change the accent pattern, but instead of doing that, I'm going to change the probability on burst. So although the accent pattern is opening up the amount per burst, rather than 1 it was going up to 2, the probability isn't going to let this happen every single time. That's a really nice musical use of that probability, just randomly letting an extra little burst come in just occasionally. Here it is against the kick and the other sound. So for this final patch, we're going to look at using burst as a kind of wonky clock generator. Now, I'm not plugging anything into burst to trigger it or to ping it. You can actually tap this encoder to create the tempo. And it just records a time between the last 2 taps. Cycle is on. And again, I have the end of cycle coming out to trigger this kick sound. It's just a reference for tempo. The main trigger out is triggering and moving a Turing machine, which I'm sequencing my pitch with, and triggering my main sequence. This sound. The Turing machine is creating the triggers for this kick. And I'll move between being able to hear how this kick pattern changes and the sequence. We'll start with all of it in. Now I have 8 evenly spaced notes. And what I'm going to do is modulate the distribution to make these squash and compress and expand as to whether these bursts start fast and slow down or start slower and speed up like a bouncing ball. And it's this blue trace on data, a slow LFO, that I'm going to modulate with. Now it's still going to fit 8 into that space, but how they're distributed and spread from even in the middle to the more extremes at either side is dependent on this modulation. But if I attenuate this LFO, I'm going to speed it up a little bit so we can see it on the oscilloscope. And because we're just using a tiny bit of modulation, which adds to the setting on the pot, we've got this kind of wonky clock feel. Just going to attenuate it even more. Here's the kick. We can hear it's just not always quite sort of in sync and grid-like. Same when we just play the sequence on its own. Feels like it's speeding up and slowing down slightly. And really subtle modulation just to create this wonkiness and human-like feel can be great for triggering parts for that human-like feel or added wonkiness, or not keeping everything to a grid, which we tend to end up doing in modular a lot of the time. Just going to modulate this a little bit heavier, bring the other sounds back. So thanks for watching. Go check out the Muck Slicer video, and when you've watched that, go check out the Rampage video, Hex Mix, Hexpander, and other Befaco videos that I will link below. These are a great pairing, and there's a link to juggling rhythms and playing around with them both together in the video description. Go support me on Patreon if you'd like early access to content and extra bonus content that everyone gets over there exclusively. Cheers for watching.